So we have been leading up to this for some time, and we are finally here, the Elizabethan Era. This is widely considered by most theatrical historians to be kind of the golden era of theater. This is when theater will retake its crown as the predominant form of entertainment, and will also start to take the shape that we most commonly recognize it as in the modern day. This is the era of all of the great classic playwrights, which we will all talk about, and including probably the most famous playwright of all, Mr. Shakespeare. So we are going to cover all of that, but after centuries of being pushed to the side and being largely forgotten and being condemned as a den of sin, theater is finally making a comeback here in the Elizabethan era. So let's just acquaint ourselves a little bit with how this kind of happened. So the Elizabethan era, going from about 1558 to 1603, so called because it was the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. Theatrically, we tend to consider the Elizabethan era to extend a little bit past the death of Queen Elizabeth and into the reign of King Charles I, as most of the plays were still being written. Some of the classics were yet to be written by that time. So it doesn't necessarily coincide with her life, but her as the queen was kind of one of those big, important historical moments. And for theater, it was a godsend because it finally had someone in power who was a supporter, but we'll get to that in a second. So, as we've discussed, theater has been regulated for the past couple centuries to either academic study, and any new plays that are being written are all being written in universities to be discussed rather than performed, or it's been regulated to street theater, kind of like the Commedia dell'arte. So how do we get from there to, theaters being built, plays being written, actors being employed? As with everything that we kind of do with these videos, the true step by step took a very long time, but condensing it down, theater had started to kind of worm its way back into popularity with little things, especially as it relates to the rich and their desire to have entertainment. One of the earliest forms of drama to come out of this time period is what we would call an interlude. These were short little plays that could be performed at a residence or some local pub or something, some place where people could come and see it, but it wasn't a building specifically built for it. And most of these were done, again, at the parties of rich people, because, again, you had no games to watch, you had no movies to discuss, so you get all these rich folks together, they want some entertainment, so a couple of short plays in between dinner courses was a great way to entertain yourself back then. So these interludes started to get more and more elaborate. They started to get longer and longer and longer, and you can kind of see the path the evolution took. Another popular form is what they called school dramas, which is exactly what it sounds like. Just like we in our school do productions every year, local schools, local universities would do staged productions for class, and just like we do, they'd invite people to come see them, sometimes just family and friends, and then more people would come and see. Again, you got to keep in mind, this is back when you had literally nothing else to do. So going and seeing the high school or university play sounded like aces as opposed to sitting around and watching the rats chew off your face. That was a bit graphic. Anywho, back to the story. So as these school productions began to gain in stature, once again, rich folks began to say, hey, I really like this play. I'd like to pay you all, and by you all we mean pay the headmaster of the school, not necessarily the students performing or the ones who wrote it. Well, we'd like to pay you all to come to my, glamorous estate and perform this for me and all my rich friends. And of course, who's going to turn down that? So these school shows were now being done for large parties and now being performed in front of royalty. This led to the creation of what they call boys' troupes, meaning they were professional acting troupes that toured all around to various parties in various locations. So from these and from the interludes, we begin to see theater starting taking hold, more people wanting to view it, and now theaters are going to be built. Actors are going to become a profession, and plays are going to be written. To understand the impact of the Elizabethan era playwrights, we have to understand something about the neoclassics, which we just covered. So we spent a lot of time covering the neoclassical movement and the rules that they concocted to regulate theater and to regulate how plays should be written. We talked about how most of the plays of that era were being written for academic performance, and therefore the rules were originally conceived as a means of grading, and from there spread out into this widespread philosophy that a lot of cultures adhered to during this time. We talked again about the multitude of rules. We talked about decorum and that people had to behave as society deemed they should. We talked about verisimilitude, that the productions had to be seen as true to life. We talked about genre and the fact that comedies and tragedies could never mix. Tragedies had to end sad, comedies had to end happy. Tragedies always dealt with the nobility and the royalty, where comedies dealt with the common people. We talked about the three unities of time, place, and action, that plays had to take place within a 24-hour span and had to occur in real time, that they were restricted to one location and one plot and a relatively small set of characters. We talked about the elimination of things such as the Deus Ex Machina, the chorus, any kind of supernatural being. So these were the rules that were set up and harshly enforced amongst the academia of the time. Now, why we bring this up is because as the Elizabethan era dawned, and as a new generation of playwrights were coming into their own, for one reason or another, those playwrights took a good hard look at the rules set down by the neoclassical movement, and collectively, almost to a man, they said, "Screw that." The Elizabethan playwrights rejected the neoclassical rules. We don't really know why this happened. Whether it was because theater was now being taken out of the universities and was now being presented as mass entertainment, or because the plays that were being written for certain patrons, such as lords and ladies, and in some cases kings and queens, and they demanded certain things. But whatever the reason, just about every rule the neoclassical movement laid down, the Elizabethans took great pride in breaking. You can look at any of the plays of Shakespeare or any of his contemporaries, and you can see this trend. For the first time in history, we are going to see comedy and tragedy mixed. Comic bits included in tragic plays, or comedic monologues included into tragic plays. Very rarely did the Elizabethans ever tell one story with their plays. A lot of times there was a subplot, sometimes 2 or 3. If you look at Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, in that one there are 3 separate plots going with 3 sets of characters at any one time. Oh yeah, you remember that rule about violence not being permitted on stage? Well, the Elizabethans weren't having any of that, and violence was in, and the people loved it. You may remember that the neoclassics also eliminated the soliloquy, the long speech in which an actor is alone on stage speaking their thoughts to the audience. Well, the Elizabethans brought that back with great gusto. This is the golden era of the soliloquy. The higher and lower classes are mixing, and we totally do away with the concept of decorum, that just because someone is seen as a king, that doesn't necessarily make them wise, and just because someone is seen as a poor person doesn't necessarily make them stupid. We see the introduction of the episodic structure. Plays are now taking place over much wider time periods. In some of Shakespeare's histories, we see decades of events condensed into a couple of weeks. Shakespeare plays are famous for multiple locations and their use of ghosts and the supernatural. Long story short, just about any rule that was put forth by the neoclassics, the Elizabethans broke the walls down.